I thought marrying him would cost me my freedom, but I never expected it would erase my existence. The silk of my wedding dress felt heavier than it should have, like it carried every decision that had led me here, every debt that wasn't mine but somehow became my fate. And as I stood in the center of a room too large, too quiet, too perfect, I realized something terrifying. I didn't belong in this life, but it already owned me. The doors behind me closed with a soft click, the kind that shouldn't sound threatening, but did, because it meant there was no one left to witness what happened next. I didn't turn around right away. I didn't want to see him yet. I had spent the entire day pretending I was brave, pretending I had a choice, pretending this was anything other than a transaction dressed up as a wedding. My fingers tightened around the edge of the vanity, steadying myself as I stared at my reflection. 24 years old. A stranger in white. A Carter by birth, a Vaughn by force. The name felt foreign in my chest. Behind me, I heard the quiet shift of fabric, the measured sound of footsteps on polished marble, slow, controlled, like every movement was intentional, calculated. Power didn't need to rush. Power waited. I finally turned. Alexander Vaughn stood a few feet away, still in his tailored black suit, tie loosened just enough to suggest the night had begun, but not enough to make him look careless. He didn't look at me the way a husband should look at his wife. There was no curiosity, no warmth, just assessment, like I was something he had acquired but hadn't decided how to use. His eyes moved over me once, not lingering, not admiring, just noting. "You can sit," he said, his voice low, even, like we were discussing something insignificant, like the fact that I had just become his wife meant nothing at all. I didn't move. I didn't trust my legs. "Is this all of it to you?" I asked before I could stop myself, my voice quieter than I wanted, but steady enough to betray that I wasn't completely broken. One corner of his mouth shifted, not quite a smile, not quite anything human. He walked past me, slow, unbothered, pouring himself a glass of water like. This was just another night in a life filled with decisions far more important than me. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, until he finally spoke again, not looking at me, not needing to. "Let's make something clear," he said. I felt the words before I fully heard them. "You mean nothing." The air left my lungs like I'd been holding it for hours. Not shouted, not cruel in tone, just stated. Simple. Final. I stared at him, waiting for something else, for explanation, for contradiction, for anything that would make it less absolute. There was nothing. He took a sip of water, set the glass down, and finally met my eyes. "This marriage is an arrangement. Your father's debt is settled. You have a place here. That's all. That's all." 3 words that reduced everything I had been, everything I had given up, into something smaller than silence. I should have cried. I should have begged. I should have felt something louder than the quiet that spread through my chest instead. But all I felt was stillness. Cold, clear, unbreakable in a way I didn't expect. I lifted my chin slightly, meeting his gaze without flinching, and for the first time that night, something shifted. Just a flicker, barely there, but enough. Because if I meant nothing to him, then he had nothing to control. And maybe, just maybe, that was the only thing I had left. I did not sleep that night, not because I was afraid of him, but because I understood him, and that was somehow worse. The room remained quiet long after he left, the echo of his words settling into the walls like they had always belonged there, like every woman before me had heard something similar and learned to live with it. "You mean nothing." I repeated it in my head, not as an insult, but as a fact I needed to examine, to turn over until it lost its power. By the time the first light slipped through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I had made a decision. If I was nothing, then I had nothing to lose. The door opened without a knock at exactly 7 in the morning, precise, controlled, just like everything else in this house. A woman stepped in, mid-40s, posture straight, expression neutral in a way that suggested years of discipline. "Good morning, Mrs. Vaughn," she said, her tone respectful but distant, like the title mattered more than the person wearing it. Mrs. Vaughn. The name still felt like a costume. "My name is Margaret. I manage the household. Mr. Vaughn has instructed that you be made comfortable." Comfortable. I almost smiled at that. "Of course he did," I said quietly, turning away from the window. Margaret's eyes flickered for a second, just enough to show she heard something in my voice she did not expect, but she did not comment. "Breakfast is ready downstairs." A car will be available should you require anything. Require anything. The words were generous, but the meaning was clear. I could have anything within the boundaries he had set. A gilded cage with excellent service. I followed her through the halls, my bare feet silent against the polished floors, taking in the scale of everything. The ceilings stretched high above us, the walls lined with art that probably cost more than the house I grew up in. Every detail curated, controlled, perfect. It did not feel like a home. It felt like a statement. Alexander Vaughn existed above everyone else, and this place made sure no one forgot it. The dining room was already set, a long table with more seats than necessary, sunlight pouring across untouched plates. He was not there. I did not expect him to be. Does he always leave before breakfast? I asked, taking a seat at the far end of the table, choosing distance even when there was no one to sit near. Mr. Vaughn's schedule is demanding, Margaret replied smoothly. Of course it was. Men like him did not sit around waiting for mornings to begin. They controlled when the day started. I picked up the coffee cup, letting the warmth settle into my hands, grounding me in something simple, something real. For a moment, I allowed myself to imagine a different version of this morning, one where I was here by choice, one where the silence felt peaceful instead of empty. It lasted all of 3 seconds. Footsteps echoed faintly from the hallway, and I looked up just as he appeared at the entrance, already dressed for the day, already composed, like the night before had been. Nothing more than a minor inconvenience. His eyes found me immediately, not surprised, not curious, just aware, always aware. You are up early, he said, walking in without hesitation, without invitation, because he did not need one in a space that belonged entirely to him. I set the cup down carefully, meeting his gaze with the same steadiness I had found sometime between midnight and sunrise. I could not sleep, I replied. He nodded once, like that was expected, like everything about me had already been accounted for. You will adjust. Maybe. Or maybe I would not. I tilted my head slightly, studying him the way he studied everything else. Do you always speak in conclusions? I asked. Something in his expression shifted again, small, almost invisible, but real. A crack, barely there. It saves time, he said. I leaned back in the chair, folding my hands in my lap, calm in a way that surprised even me. Then let me save you some, I said softly. You bought my name. You bought my presence. But you did not buy me. The silence that followed was different this time. Not empty. Not cold. Charged. And for the first time since I stepped into his world, Alexander Vaughn did not look like a man entirely in control. Power does not announce itself when it is threatened. It becomes quieter, sharper, more interested. I saw it in the way Alexander Vaughn looked at me after my words settled between us, not with anger, not with offense, but with something far more dangerous, curiosity. For a moment, neither of us moved. The sunlight stretched across the table, catching the edge of his watch, reflecting in brief flashes that felt almost like a countdown. Then he reached for the chair at the head of the table and sat down with deliberate calm, as if reclaiming the space without needing to say a word. That is a bold statement, he said, folding his hands loosely in front of him, his voice still even, still controlled, but no longer dismissive. I did not look away. It is an honest one. He studied me in silence, longer this time, as if recalculating something he had already decided was fixed. Honesty is rarely useful in my world, he replied. It tends to complicate things. I allowed a small breath to leave my lungs, not quite a laugh, not quite anything soft. Maybe your world needs to be complicated. That earned me another shift, subtle, but there. His gaze sharpened, focusing in a way that made everything else in the room feel distant, irrelevant. You misunderstand your position, he said. Do I? I tilted my head slightly, mirroring his earlier movement without thinking. Because from where I am standing, you are the one adjusting. The words landed, quiet but precise. For the first time, he did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached for his coffee, took a measured sip, and set the cup down with exact placement. Like even small actions were controlled expressions of intent. You are here because your father made a series of decisions that required correction, he said finally. I provided that correction. By buying me, I said. Not a question. A fact. His jaw tightened, just slightly. By offering a solution. Solutions are supposed to solve something, I replied. All this did was move the problem. His eyes held mine, and this time, there was no attempt to soften the weight of that look. "Be careful," he said quietly. "There are consequences for speaking without understanding the full picture." The warning was clear, but it did not feel like a threat. It felt like a rule, one he expected everyone to follow without question. I leaned forward just enough to close the distance between us, not physically, but in presence. "Then explain it to me," I said. "Help me understand why a man like you would marry someone he considers nothing." The silence that followed was different again. Not tense, not empty, measured. He watched me like I had just become something new, something he had not accounted for when this arrangement was made. "Because," he said slowly, each word placed with intention, "nothing is easier to control than something that does not matter." The answer should have broken something in me. It should have reinforced everything he believed. Instead, it clarified something I had only begun to understand. I leaned back in my chair, letting the distance return, letting the moment settle. "Then you made your first mistake," I said softly. His expression did not change, but his attention sharpened again, like a blade catching light. "And what mistake is that?" I held his gaze, steady, unshaken, no longer reacting to him, but responding. "Assuming I would agree with you." The room went still in a way that had nothing to do with silence. Even Margaret, standing quietly near the doorway, seemed to sense the shift, her posture tightening almost imperceptibly. Alexander did not speak for several seconds. When he finally did, his voice was lower, quieter, but far more focused than before. "You are going to make this difficult," he said. I shook my head once, calm, certain. "No," I replied. "I am going to make this real." And for the first time since I walked into his world, I saw it clearly, not in his words, not in his posture, but in the space between them. He did not fear losing control of me. He feared not understanding me at all. Control does not break all at once. It shifts in quiet, almost invisible ways, and I felt it in the hours that followed, not in what Alexander Vaughn said, but in what he did not. He left shortly after breakfast, not abruptly, not with frustration, but with a measured exit that felt more like a pause than a conclusion, as if whatever had started between us had not ended, only been set aside. The house settled into silence again, but it was no longer the same silence as before. It watched. It waited. I spent the morning walking through rooms that were too perfect to belong to real life, my fingertips brushing along polished surfaces, expensive fabrics, objects that had never been touched without purpose. Everything here had a function. Everything except me. By noon, I found myself standing near the large windows in what Margaret called the east sitting room, watching the driveway below as cars came and went with quiet precision. People moved in and out of his world like pieces on a board, each one knowing their place, their role, their limits. I wondered how many of them had ever questioned it. "You will get used to it," Margaret said from behind me, her voice calm, practiced, like she had said those words many times before to many different people. I did not turn right away. "Does anyone ever not get used to it?" I asked. There was a pause, just long enough to matter. "Adjustment is expected," she replied carefully. "Expected, not optional." I let out a slow breath, pressing my palm lightly against the cool glass. "That is not what I asked." When I finally turned, her expression remained composed, but her eyes held something else now, something closer to understanding. "Some people," she said quietly, "learn where their boundaries are." Boundaries. The word lingered. Not freedom, not escape. Boundaries. I nodded once, absorbing that, filing it away. If this place had rules, then it had edges. And anything with edges could be mapped. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway drew my attention back to the window. A black sedan, sleek, precise, familiar even though I had only seen it once before. My pulse did not quicken. It steadied. I watched as the door opened and Alexander stepped out, his posture the same as always, composed, controlled. But there was something different now, something I could not name yet. He did not look up at the house right away. He spoke briefly to one of the men waiting near the entrance, a quiet exchange, efficient. Then he moved inside without hesitation. Minutes later, I heard his footsteps before I saw him, that same measured rhythm, that same quiet authority filling the space without effort. He stopped in the doorway, his gaze finding me instantly, as if he had known exactly where I would be. "You did not leave," he said. It was not a question. I turned fully to face him, letting the distance between us remain exactly as it was. Was I supposed to? I asked. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in irritation, but in focus. You have access to a car. You have staff available. Most people would have taken advantage of that. I considered that for a moment, then shook my head. Most people would have run, I said. But I am not running from something I do not understand yet. That held him still. Not physically, but in attention. And what is it you think you need to understand? He asked. I stepped closer, not enough to challenge him, just enough to meet him on equal ground. You, I said simply. The words settled between us, heavier than it should have been. His expression did not change, but the air shifted again, subtle, precise, undeniable. That is not a simple thing, he said. Neither am I replied. The silence stretched, not uncomfortable, not uncertain, just full, like something was building beneath the surface, something neither of us was willing to name yet. He studied me for a long moment, longer than before, like he was trying to find the limits Margaret had mentioned, trying to see where I would bend, where I would stop. I held his gaze, steady, unflinching, offering him nothing he could easily define. Finally, he exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, and nodded once, a decision made without explanation. Then we will see how long that lasts, he said. I did not move. I did not step back. Longer than you expect, I answered. And this time, when he turned to leave the room, it did not feel like control had returned to him. It felt like something had been shared, whether he intended it or not. The first thing I learned about Alexander Vaughn's world was that nothing happened by accident. Not the timing of a door opening, not the placement of a single chair, not even the way people spoke when his name was mentioned. And yet, over the next few days, something began to shift in ways that did not feel planned at all. It started small, almost invisible, the kind of change most people would miss if they were not paying attention. But I was paying attention now. I had to be. I noticed that Margaret no longer hovered quite as close, as if she had been given quiet instructions to give me space without making it obvious. I noticed that the staff stopped watching me like I might break something simply by existing. And I noticed that no one told me where I could or could not go inside the house anymore. Not directly, not with words, but the absence of restriction was its own kind of message. On the third morning, I did something simple, something small enough to be dismissed, but deliberate enough to matter. I walked into the kitchen myself. The room was already alive with quiet movement, the soft rhythm of preparation, the scent of coffee and fresh bread filling the air. Conversation stopped the second I stepped inside, not out of fear, but out of uncertainty. I was not supposed to be here. That much was clear. I could feel it in the way their eyes shifted, in the subtle pause of hands mid-motion. I let the silence sit for a second, then moved forward like I belonged. Good morning, I said, my voice calm, steady, like this was the most normal thing in the world. No one answered right away. Then one of the younger staff members, a girl who could not have been older than 20, gave a small nod. Good morning, Mrs. Vaughn. The title still felt distant, but I did not reject it this time. I walked over to the counter, pouring myself a cup of coffee without asking, without waiting for permission that no one had offered. You do not have to stop working because I am here, I added, glancing around the room. That broke the tension. Just enough. Movements resumed, quiet conversations picked up again, and the space shifted from something formal and controlled into something almost human. Almost. I stayed there longer than I needed to, not speaking much, just existing in a place that had not been designed for someone like me. And for the first time since I arrived, I did not feel like an object placed in a perfect room. I felt present. It was later that afternoon when I saw the result of that small decision. Alexander was in his office when I passed by, the door slightly open, voices low inside, the kind of conversation that carried weight even when the words were not clear. I did not stop. I did not listen. I kept walking, because whatever happened behind that door was not mine to know. But his voice followed me anyway. Emily. I paused, turned. He stood just inside the doorway now, alone, the conversation already dismissed, his attention fully on me. You went into the kitchen this morning, he said. Not a question. Never a question. I met his gaze, steady, unbothered. Yes. He watched me for a moment, measuring, calculating, but there was something else beneath it now, something quieter, less certain. That is not necessary, he said. I tilted my head slightly. Neither is half of what exists in this house, I replied. But it is still here. The corner of his jaw tightened, not in anger, but in thought. You are changing things, he said after a pause. I almost smiled. No, I said softly. I am just not pretending they are fixed. That held him longer than I expected. Longer than he would have allowed a few days ago. And in that silence, I saw it again, clearer this time. Not control, not dominance, but something unfamiliar pressing against both of us at the same time. He had built a world where everything had a place. And somehow, without asking, without permission, I had stepped into it and refused to fit. The moment something shifts, you do not always see it in actions. Sometimes you see it in attention, in the way someone who never used to look twice suddenly starts noticing everything. And that was what changed next. It began with silence, not the distant kind that filled the house, but the kind that followed me, the kind that lingered just a second longer than it should have. I felt it in the hallway outside the library, where I had started spending my afternoons, flipping through books that were far older than me, filled with histories I had never been meant to read. I was not looking for anything specific. I was learning the shape of his world. And his world, I realized, was built on patterns. Precise, predictable, controlled. Except now, there was a disruption. Me. I did not hear him approach this time. I sensed him. The faint shift in the air, the quiet pause in everything around me. When I looked up, Alexander was already there, standing near the doorway, not entering, not announcing himself, just watching. Not like before. Not assessing. Observing. I closed the book slowly, marking the page with my finger. Do you always stand there without saying anything? I asked, my voice calm, unhurried. His gaze did not move from me. Only when I am trying to understand something, he replied. I let that settle, then tilted my head slightly. And have you figured it out yet? A pause. Not long, but real. No, that answer surprised me. Not because of what it meant, but because he allowed it to exist. A man like him was not supposed to admit uncertainty. I stood up, placing the book back where I found it, my movements deliberate, measured, mirroring his in ways I had not noticed until now. Then you are looking in the wrong place, I said. He stepped into the room finally, slow, controlled, closing the distance just enough to shift the balance again. And where should I be looking? He asked. I met his gaze fully, steady, unguarded. Not at what I do, I said quietly. At why I do it. Something in his expression changed again. Not a crack, not a break, a shift, like a door that had been locked for a long time had just been tested. People do not usually reveal their reasons so easily, he said. I almost smiled. That is because most people are afraid of what those reasons say about them. The silence that followed was different again. Not heavy, not tense, focused. He studied me like I had just given him something valuable, something he did not know how to use yet. And you are not afraid? He asked. I shook my head once. No, I said simply. Because I already know what mine are. He took another step closer, close enough now that the space between us felt intentional, not accidental. And what are they? He asked. His voice was quieter this time, not commanding, not distant. Curious. I held his gaze, not backing away, not closing the distance either. To not disappear, I said. The words were simple, but they carried everything. Everything I had lost. Everything I refused to lose again. He did not respond immediately. For the first time since I met him, Alexander Vaughn did not have a ready answer. His eyes searched mine, not for weakness, not for compliance, but for something real, something undeniable. And for a second, just one, I saw it. Not power, not control, recognition. He stepped back first. Barely, but enough to matter. You are not what I expected, he said quietly. I exhaled slowly, the tension in my chest easing just enough to breathe. Neither are you, I replied. That held him there. Not as a man in control of a situation, but as someone standing at the edge of something unfamiliar. And for the first time, it was not me trying to understand his world. It was him trying to understand mine. The first sign that something was wrong did not come from Alexander. It came from the world around him, because a world built on control reacts the moment something slips out of place. And that morning, everything felt just slightly off. It started with the staff. Conversation stopped too quickly when I entered a room, not out of formality this time, but out of caution. Margaret's composure remained intact, but there was a tightness in her movements, a precision that felt less natural and more enforced. Even the air felt different, heavier, like the house itself was holding its breath. I noticed it before anyone said a word, because I had learned to notice everything. I was standing near the front hall when the first unfamiliar car pulled into the driveway. Not one of the usual sleek vehicles that came and went with quiet purpose, but something darker, less polished, more deliberate in its presence. It did not belong here, and yet it stopped at the center of the drive as if it had every right to be there. I watched from the window as two men stepped out, their movements controlled but not refined, their posture carrying a different kind of authority, one that did not blend into the elegance of this place. They did not wait to be greeted. They moved toward the entrance like they expected the door to open. And it did. The shift inside the house was immediate. Subtle. Invisible to anyone who did not understand what they were seeing. But I did. Staff members moved with sharper focus. Conversations disappeared entirely. And somewhere deeper in the house, a door closed with more force than necessary. I did not step back. I stayed where I was, watching, listening, letting the moment unfold instead of retreating from it. The front doors opened, and the men entered without hesitation, their eyes scanning the space with quiet calculation. One of them glanced in my direction, just briefly, but long enough to register me as something unexpected. Not fear, not threat, just not part of the plan. "You should not be here." Margaret's voice came from behind me, low, controlled, but urgent in a way I had not heard before. I turned slowly, meeting her gaze. "Neither should they," I replied. Her expression tightened, just slightly. "This is not something you need to involve yourself in." I considered that for a moment, then shook my head. "I am already involved," I said quietly. Because I was. Whether I understood the rules or not, I was part of this world now, and pretending otherwise would not change that. Footsteps echoed from the far hallway, familiar this time, steady, controlled, unmistakable. Alexander appeared seconds later, his presence cutting through the tension without raising his voice, without changing his pace. He stopped a few feet from the men, his posture relaxed, but his attention absolute. "You are early," he said, his tone even, as if this was a scheduled meeting and not an intrusion. One of the men gave a slight nod, something close to respect, but not quite. "Plans change," he replied. The words were simple, but they carried weight, the kind that did not need explanation. I watched Alexander carefully, looking for any sign of reaction, any shift in control. There was none, but there was something else, something beneath the surface. Not uncertainty, awareness. He knew this was not routine. He knew something had shifted. And then, for just a second, his eyes moved. Not to the men, to me. It was quick, almost unnoticeable, but it was there. A calculation, a decision. When he looked back at them, his expression had not changed, but the room had. "We will speak in my office," he said. Not a suggestion, a direction. The men hesitated for half a second, then nodded, falling into step behind him as he turned without waiting. Control restored. On the surface. But as they disappeared down the hallway, the tension did not leave with them. It lingered. It settled. And I understood something then, something clear and undeniable. This world was not as stable as it looked. And for the first time since I stepped into it, I was not just an outsider trying to understand it. I was someone standing exactly where the cracks were beginning to show. The house did not return to normal after that, because once tension reveals itself, it does not disappear, it lingers in the spaces people try to ignore. And I felt it long after the office door closed behind Alexander and the two men who did not belong here. Time moved differently that afternoon, slower, heavier, like every second was waiting for something to happen. I stayed where I was longer than I should have, my reflection faint against the glass, my thoughts sharper than before. I did not know who those men were, but I understood what they represented. Disruption. And disruption did not enter a world like this without consequence. "You should go upstairs," Margaret said quietly, her voice steady but firmer than usual. I glanced at her, then back toward the hallway where they had disappeared. "Is that a suggestion or an order?" I asked. She held my gaze for a moment, then lowered it slightly, a subtle shift that told me everything I needed to know. "A precaution," she replied. I nodded once, not arguing, not resisting, but I did not move right away either. Because for the first time since I arrived, I was not being guided for my comfort. I was being moved for my safety. And that changed everything. I turned and walked toward the stairs slowly, deliberately, my steps quiet against the polished floor, but I did not go far. Halfway up, I stopped. Not out of fear. Out of instinct. Something in me refused to retreat completely. The voices from the office were too distant to make out clearly, but the tone carried through the walls, low, controlled, edged with something sharper than anything I had heard from Alexander before. Not anger. Not loss of control. Something more precise. Calculation under pressure. Minutes passed. Maybe more. It was impossible to tell. Then the door opened. The sound echoed faintly, but enough. I turned slightly, just enough to see the hallway below without being seen myself. The two men stepped out first, their expressions unchanged, but their movements tighter now, less certain than when they arrived. They did not look around this time. They left quickly, the front doors closing behind them with a finality that settled deep into the house. Silence followed. Not the quiet kind. The kind that comes after something important has just happened. Alexander stepped out last. Alone. He paused in the hallway, his posture still composed, but there was something different now, something that had not been there before. Not weakness. Not hesitation. Awareness. He stood there for a moment, completely still, like he was replaying every word that had just been said, measuring it, breaking it apart, deciding what came next. Then his head lifted slightly, and he looked directly at the stairs. At me. I did not step back. I did not hide. I met his gaze from where I stood, halfway between leaving and staying, between being protected and choosing to remain. His eyes held mine longer than they should have, longer than necessary. And in that moment, something unspoken passed between us, something neither of us had acknowledged until now. I was no longer separate from this. Whatever had just happened included me. He moved first, walking toward the base of the stairs with the same controlled steps. But there was a difference now. Not in his power. In his focus. It was no longer split between his world and everything outside of it. It was on me. Entirely. You should not have stayed, he said, his voice low, not harsh, not distant, but closer than before. I rested my hand lightly against the railing, steady, grounded. Neither should you, I replied softly. That stopped him. Not physically, but in thought. The space between us felt different now, charged in a way that had nothing to do with control and everything to do with consequence. He looked at me like I had just crossed a line he had not drawn, but could not ignore. This is not something you understand, he said. I nodded slightly, acknowledging the truth without accepting the distance. Then help me understand, I said. Because if it affects you, it affects me. The words settled into the space between us, undeniable, unavoidable. He did not respond immediately. For the first time, Alexander Vaughn looked like a man standing at a choice, not a command. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than I had ever heard it. That is exactly the problem, he said. And in that moment, I understood something I had not seen before. I was not just changing his world. I was becoming part of what could threaten it. There is a moment when everything changes, not with noise, not with chaos, but with a quiet realization that settles deeper than anything spoken, and I felt it standing there on the stairs, looking down at Alexander Vaughn as he looked up at me like I had become something he could no longer ignore. The house was still, the kind of stillness that comes after a storm you never saw, but somehow felt pass through every wall, every hallway, every breath. Then tell me what the problem is, I said softly, my voice steady, not demanding, not afraid, just certain. He did not answer right away. His gaze shifted slightly, not away from me, but inward, like he was measuring something he had never needed to measure before. Time stretched between us, long enough for doubt to exist, long enough for him to step back into the role he had held so perfectly since the beginning. But he did not. Instead, he took a slow breath, the kind that does not belong to a man in complete control, and stepped closer to the base of the stairs, reducing the distance without closing it entirely. The problem, he said finally, his voice lower now, stripped of the distance he once used like armor, is that you are not supposed to matter. The words landed differently this time. Not like before. Not like something meant to erase me. This time, they sounded like a warning. I rested my hand more firmly on the railing, grounding myself in the moment, in the space that had become something neither of us expected. And yet I do, I replied quietly. He did not argue. He did not dismiss it. That alone told me everything. His jaw tightened slightly, not in frustration, but in recognition of something he could not easily fix. People who matter become targets, he said. They complicate decisions. They create variables that cannot be controlled. I listened carefully, not just to his words, but to what he was not saying. And you do not like variables, I said. I eliminate them, he corrected, his tone calm. But there was no edge to it, no threat, just a statement of how his world functioned. I nodded slowly, absorbing that, letting it settle before I spoke again. Then why am I still here? The question was simple, but it carried everything. He held my gaze, unflinching, but for the first time, there was no immediate answer waiting behind his eyes. That silence was louder than anything he could have said, because it meant he did not know. Or worse, he did know, and did not want to admit it. I took a slow step down, then another, closing part of the distance between us, not as a challenge, but as a choice. You could have sent me away, I continued softly. You could have kept this exactly the way you wanted it. Clean, controlled, simple. I stopped a few steps above him, close enough now that the space between us felt intentional, charged with something neither of us had defined. But you did not. His eyes did not leave mine. Not for a second. No, he said quietly. The single word held more weight than anything else he had said. I exhaled slowly, feeling something shift inside me, something that had been building since the night he told me I meant nothing. Then maybe I am not the problem, I said. Maybe I am the part you did not plan for. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of everything he could not control, everything I refused to surrender, everything that had begun the moment our worlds collided. He looked at me like he was seeing the outcome of a decision he had already made, even if he had not admitted it yet. You are dangerous, he said finally. Not as an accusation, as a realization. I almost smiled, just slightly, not in victory, but in understanding. No, I said softly. I am real. And for the first time, Alexander Vaughn did not look like a man deciding what to do next. He looked like a man realizing that whatever came next was no longer entirely up to him.